Okay, so we've already covered interest rates and covered utility costs, but Kal mentioned something earlier on about council tax across HMOs. So what are the possible threats on the horizon for property investors at the moment, apart from the ones we've already talked about? We've covered interest rate rises, like you mentioned. We've covered utility costs. We know that there's issues with council tax, potentially on HMOs, putting them onto individual rooms. We've already had selective licensing in Nottingham and quite a few other places. I don't know whether that still be rolling out or whether there's some pushback against that. I've noticed quite a few people have been pushing back against that. Any other threats that we might need to be aware of on the horizon?
There is one that not many people know about, and it's not many councils that have adopted it, but there is an argument. There is a couple of councils that are insisting on 3 square metres for an ensuite bathroom, which for someone like me who's ace with space is clearly not something I want to be restricted to, because you can get a very good ensuite bathroom, 1.5 square metres, maybe even less than that if you plan it well. And when you take 3 square metres out of a 10 square metre room, you're down to 9 square metres on a good day, but you might be going below that 8.6 square metres for a HMO room. So it just means that you're limiting the number of rooms you can do en suites in. There's obviously a reason for this, why they're making these rules up. And I think, as Kal mentioned with tax, so the only thing with the council tax, I kind of get it, because obviously the government is always looking to get as much money out of, and they think when something becomes popular, like HMOs, or how can we get more money out of this product? It's a bit like car tax, isn't it? We were told to go onto diesel, we went into diesel, and then they started charging us for using diesel cars, and then we went into fuel, now we're going to electric, everyone's been pushing to electric. Car tax used to be based on emissions, it's now based on the value of the car and its purchase. What's that mean? Yeah, and it's the same with all of these things that are going to come in, but to take the point that Jim made earlier, what's the alternative? Even if council tax does get added to an HMO, at some point that's going to be across all HMOs.
It's going to be the normal.
It's going to be the norm. Yeah. We're just going to have to pay for it. It's the only thing which is constant is change. So I think one of the things that again Kal mentioned is future-proofing schemes and maybe thinking a bit more intelligently. So I am actually speaking to clients now who are saying, "Oh, I fully en-suited." And we have this conversation quite a lot. Fully en suites. I'm like, okay, have you thought that one through? In this area, is that what is required? Because if you could share a bathroom between 2 rooms, then clearly, if that licensing or the council tax comes in and you're sharing a bathroom, you're not going to cop it, are you? So it may just keep the wolf from the door for a bit longer. And actually, if you just raise the level of accommodation and make it, it's a nice accommodation, people will accept the fact they're sharing rather than cramming in en suites everywhere, which maybe doesn't work so well. So it's knowing your market, not listening to what the trends are, thinking about a business model. And Jim, I learn this not from the internet. I learn it from the clients because my clients are going through this, and we're having these conversations, on each project.
So excellent. That's exactly the sort of thing we're looking for. So threats to potentially the size of en suites. Anyone else got any threats that they're seeing on the horizon?
In terms of tax, one of the things that has come out recently is the increased tax yield from people accidentally falling into capital gains tax or inheritance tax because limits have been frozen or they haven't geared their tax planning in the right way. So that accidental tax increase is where people need to keep their circumstances under review.
Is this like things with the increase in the value of properties and then spousal and transfers, stuff like that, or just generally?
Yeah, generally. I mean, they're talking billions of pounds in terms of capital gains tax and inheritance tax as an increased yield. I think compared to 2020 to 2021, it's something like £9 billion extra in terms of capital gains tax and inheritance tax.
Do you think the allowances will go up?
No, they've frozen them for at least 5 years.
2026.
Yeah, so I don't see that they're going to change those. I think what they will do is they'll keep everything frozen, but they may increase things like ATED, the tax on enveloped dwellings, so that all of a sudden you'll find that these properties that you've got in a limited company where you thought there was protection, you'll suddenly be paying an annual tax charge just for holding them.
So that's the information. What's the actionable step for someone if they might find themselves in that situation?
Well, you've got to keep your situation under review. So where you've come up, for example, Umesh will be able to tell you this, where you've come up with a will and a plan for estate planning, that should be reviewed on a regular basis so that you know what happened 2 years ago doesn't apply to your circumstances now, and therefore you re-evaluate where you're going in terms of your estate planning, your transaction planning in terms of which properties you're going to dispose of, which properties you might put in trust, which properties you want to hold on to personally, and those are all the sorts of things that you need to keep under review on a regular basis.
No, excellent. I totally get it. So the real message to everyone is an urgency of doing a review no matter what your situation
Absolutely.
is. So
There's a frightening number of people who don't have any plan, don't have any wills,
Do you know the
haven't put powers of
percentage?
attorney in place.
Is it something like 73% of people don't have wills? 75% of people?
That's right.
Yeah.
It's the first question I ask every client. Do you have wills? Do you have powers of attorney? Because intestacy can be an absolute disaster.
The problem you also get is you'll get people that say, yeah, I've got a will, I did it 10 years ago. So, well, you should have reviewed it, but I've not bought anything since. I've only got the same 4 properties I had. Well, what's the value of those properties
Exactly.
now?
Mm.
That's more important. It's not about how many more you've added to.
or like you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
changing status of relationships.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because there's so many things to take into consideration, and because you don't know about these things, you really need to sit down with somebody that is an expert in that and sit down with them and say, okay, this is my circumstance, this is my family, because families change as well. You have different people coming into the family, people marrying and all sorts. So you need to keep up to date with that. Anytime there's a change in your circumstances, do a review.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be a detailed review, because with some of our clients that we've done estate plans for them, it's an annual conversation, how's things going, but if there's some changes have happened, we'll sit down and we'll have a proper review with them.
And even if you do a small rewrite on the will, it's
Nothing,
it's a few quid.
yeah. But
So
it's
that's
worth,
reviews.
it's worth spending that time and money actually making sure that you are.
So we've actually got Adrian with a possible future threat. Herschel's actually telling us about current real threats right now, immediate, that need action. Kal, a threat that you might see on the horizon? Property risk?
Well, one of the things that people need to consider is obviously with everything that's going on, a lot of people have lost their jobs, tenants not being able to pay. And that's a massive problem at the moment for people, because I know we had it in one of our properties. We had a terrible antisocial tenant in there. It took us 9 months to get her out. Again, we had to go to court, and the court process is so long-winded now as well, isn't it? So it's knowing what you should and shouldn't do in those circumstances. There's a lot of people who've got maybe 1 or 2 properties and they're trying to manage them themselves, and they've got themselves into a lot of trouble because they haven't given the right notices to the tenant, or the tenant didn't have the right paperwork when they first moved in, which then means it's taking them, a year, 2 years and so on to actually get rid of this person.
I want to bring up a threat, professional tenants. You've got people who are professional tenants who know the law.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that's not really discussed in the property circles, where people know the law so well and they get support from charities. I'm not sure I actually want to mention the charity name, but they're effectively told how to help.
Doesn't actually house anybody. Yeah.
But tells people how to stay in a property, which I find funny, because you can go into a supermarket and if you walk out with a chocolate bar, you'll get arrested.
Yeah.
You'll get arrested if you walk out with anything of any value in a supermarket or a shop, and you get classed as theft. Whereas if you have property and you default on your payment deliberately, it's classed as civil, and it can take up to months and sometimes even years to actually get taken out.
It's not just the charities that tell them to stay either. I mean, the council tell them to stay until
Yes.
the bailiff
Council,
comes.
because they don't want to look after
Yeah,
them.
they don't want them to be homeless, do they?
I've had clients who've had the council say to tenants specifically, if you
Leave.
accept moving out, you've made yourself intentionally homeless, and therefore we won't support you. So you have to stay in there until your landlord forces you out.
Legally.
Yeah, so it's a big, that's,
not with a baseball bat.
Without the Russian mafia bit.
Yeah.
so that's a big threat. We've still got 2 more with the current potential threats. Pete, what do you see?
I think that the new legislation regarding EPCs are
It's a good one.
really
It's a good one.
the scene, because going from memory, it's any new tenancies from 2025 have to be EPC C or above. 2029, any existing tenancies. So that's okay with existing tenancies, but how do you upgrade an EPC enough with the tenancy in place? It's bad enough doing it when the property's empty. If you've got to upgrade thermal layers,
Especially if a tenant doesn't let you in.
especially if they have to let you in,
Because they know then you're going to be in
it's
breach of your...
intrusive enough doing that to an empty house, let alone doing it into, before 2029 when you've actually got a long-standing tenant in there who may have been, really, really good tenant, paying the bills every single month on time, keeping the house in really, really good nick. But now the government are telling you, well, if you want to continue that tenancy, now you need to insulate the ground floor. You need to put solar panels on the roof. You need to insulate all the external walls.
I think this
So I
is
think this is going to, I think it's just going to massively disrupt
We need to get more on this onto the group about these potential changes that are occurring.
And also, what could you do, and what would you need to do to actually hit those two levels as well?
I'm not sure if it's a threat, but it is something which we're dealing with, and I know Jim and Pete on schemes we're working on right now have been up against this, which is the National Space Standards. Now that's recently come in. Like a lot of things, when these standards come in, they're not fully understood by the people that have to implement them, i.e. the councils. So the National Space Standards were brought in effectively to create good accommodation in terms of space on new builds. And there is actually a caveat in their National Space Standards that says for commercial conversions or for refurbishments, there is some flexibility within those numbers. To date, I've not really come across anyone that's adopted those standards but has any flexibility for a commercial to residential conversion. They still refer to 37 square metres minimum for a 1-bed and 61 for a 2-bed. So we've had the situation on a project where the council have actually applied the 37 square metres to a studio apartment. So if you think about the logic of that, a 1-bedroom apartment is 37 square metres for a reason, because you can fit a bedroom in it. If you've got a studio apartment, that's generally because you can't fit a bedroom in, so you have to have an open plan kitchen, living, dining, sleeping space. But to apply the same square meterage to that is a nonsense. And you and your client had to walk away from a project purely because it just didn't stack. So there's a property left vacant now that's not being converted because of a National Space Standard that's been incorrectly applied. So that is potentially a threat. Now, we have got through that because, again, the space standards talk about 1 bed, one person, 1 bed, 2 person, 2 bed, 3 person, 2 bed, 4 person. What's missing? The 2 bed, 2 person. If you've got a mini mo and you've got 2 individuals in individual rooms renting that property, that doesn't fall into the space standard. So we've interpolated between the 61 square metres and the 39, and we've come up with like a 53 number, and we've actually got planning permission approved for 2-bed apartments with that space standard, with that argument to the council. So a lot of the time it's about testing these and challenging these standards that come through, because they won't actually become, sort of user-friendly until people have actually,
and talked about.
And also, you've got to think about the reason behind it as well. And the reason behind it is a good reason to create nice space. But for someone like me, who's creative with space, I could probably make a 35 square metre apartment more desirable than a badly designed 40 square metre apartment. And have more innovative storage solutions in that property, which make it more user-friendly. So it goes against the grain for a designer, just be working to a square metre figure. But it is something to be aware of.
And also as well, I'll just add to that, it's working counterintuitively against first-time buyers and people wanting to get on the property market as well, because development costs are going, you can't fit as many units in the same amount of space. So ultimately your unit costs are going to go up, and you're going to have a certain amount of people that are going to be priced out of the market. So before, with the studio apartments, that might have been a great starter home for someone. It might have been a price point that they could afford within their budget. Now these minimum space standards, they put the size up, but also the prices up. So you've got more people now who can't afford to get on the property ladder because of these.
Yeah, and I'll agree to Alan's the planning side. There is no continuity between different councils with these standards and what their opinions are. So the particular one we walked away from was in one council, and the project I just spoke of, we did actually have a 1-bed apartment 35.5 square metres
Yeah.
under the national space standard, only by 1.5 metres, but that got approved without even being questioned.
If it's a national standard, how can one council differentiate? from another?
Guidelines.
It's just guidelines,
Guidelines
it's
more
not
than
actual,
anything. Yeah.
It's a guideline, but it's being used as a rule.
Yeah.
and it's
Okay.
jobs worth.
It's just interpretation,
The thing is,
individual interpretation.
When you
Depends
go-
on how much that council has adopted that.
And
Yeah.
it's easier to use it as a rule than it is to actually interpolate. Because if you interpolate and you're the council, you are risking getting it wrong. If you just call it a rule, it's 37 square metres every time. That's an easy decision, isn't it? So that's why it needs to be challenged.
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, there is a risk attached to that. Because if you're up against a council which will not budge, which we've been in that situation, even though the planning consultant has actually agreed that that is completely a wrong interpretation of the national space standards, what can you do?
Jim, you're up with that last question. What's the current potential threat?
Well, I'll lead on from that with the planning theme and just say, in general, planning can be a threat.
Jobs worth,
Yeah, I think having done probably several applications with probably about 5 different councils in the past 18 months, because of quite a few around the Nottinghamshire area, every council has their different opinions and different ways of working and different speeds of getting back to you, and there is absolutely no way to guess how quickly someone's going through sometimes. You look at the planning application, it goes through validation, you have the 8-week period which it's supposed to get back to you by the decision day. I've not had a single application come back by the decision day. I think the quickest one was about 15-16 weeks. As mentioned earlier, I've got one which is currently 2 years into it. We had it approved at committee meeting, but it's not been officially rubber stamped because of it's gone to the Secretary of State and higher levels through the Environment Agency, so we can't actually start the build. So luckily we own that in a SAS actually at the minute, so we're not paying any interest. But if you had that on a bridge and you've been sat on 2 years, you'd kill it. Yeah. So it's just to be aware that if you're going to planning and trying to do this, what are your risks if it A gets refused or B it takes longer than the 8 weeks everyone thinks it's going to happen in. I think some of the projects we've had, like I said, is exchange with delayed completion, so we've got very minimal risk up front, option agreements, or buying something with a prior approval or permitted development rights. So
De-risking, a lot of de-risking there, isn't there?
yes.
In terms of existing costs, I think one of the things that is going to come home to roost very quickly is the whole issue of cladding and flats, because nobody has yet quantified what that cost is going to be. And from a tax perspective, it's not a tax deductible expense against rental, it's going to be capital. So you're going to end up not being able to actually take a deduction for that cost until you're disposing of the property.